Hello, this is Digital Accessibility, the people behind the progress. I'm Joe Walensky, the creator and host of this series. And as an accessibility professional myself, I find it very interesting as to how others have found their way into this profession. So let's meet one of those people right now and hear about their journey. All right, well, here we are ready to do another podcast where I get an opportunity to have a chat with an accessibility practitioner. And today I am speaking with Lorelei Root. Hello, Lorelei. How are you doing today?
Hi, I'm pretty good, thanks. Trying not to melt in this heat wave we're having, but otherwise pretty good.
Well, where are you talking to us from?
Guelph, Ontario. Yeah, not too far outside of Toronto.
All right, well, I'm at my home office on Vashon Island, which is near Blink's Seattle headquarters. And so it's been hot here as well, but not as much as other parts of the world. It's good to have you here as part of this. And always a good place to start is if you could tell us a little bit about your current position and the type of work that you're involved in.
Sure, yeah. So I work as a digital accessibility specialist with a specific focus. My career has had a specific focus on video game accessibility. Currently, I work for a company that's actually does corporate training experiences, but a lot of the same tools used in video game development, I'm using to kind of help make sure that all of their experiential learning is as accessible as possible, especially since it's gone virtual. So I work for a corporate training company called Eagles Flight right now, where I'm their digital accessibility specialist, but I also work on contract for a few different game developers as well. And I'm helping inform the design of video games that are currently in the making.
All right, that's great to hear about that. And I have some things I want to ask about your current activities. But one of the things I always like to do in this program is to kind of find out where people got their start with work life, live life for accessibility. So kind of open it up to you as to where to start in terms of your career, what led you to your current career path.
For myself, I am a disabled woman myself. I have multiple sclerosis and some other health things as well. And I had a massive ischemic stroke in 2014. And that's really when I shifted my focus from just video game development to specifically video game accessibility. And really, it kind of all started because I was a little kid who liked to play games and always wanted to work on games. And then one day found myself unable to play games anymore in 2014 at 24 years old. And just kind of realized that there was so far we had to go to making video games more accessible. So I really shifted my focus at that time to the accessibility side of things. And part of that was just naturally, as like being disabled, I really wanted to advocate for my own needs and for the removal of barriers for my own experience. And as it's gone on, I've had the pleasure of working with other disabled individuals with different types of disabilities, and kind of been able to collaborate with them on making sure that things are widely accessible to people with a range of disabilities. So yeah, I think it all kind of started in 2014 when I had my stroke. I had a massive ischemic stroke, which was caused by a blood clot, and it blocked the blood flow to my brain. So as a result of that, for a very long period of time, I was unable to speak anymore. I couldn't do most things that I used to enjoy doing, but some of the big ones were difficulty with speaking, difficulty with reading and writing. I had the entire left side of my body was paralyzed and I couldn't use it or feel it. So all of a sudden I just couldn't do the thing that I love to do for fun anymore. And it was really difficult. And I had a speech language pathologist actually who would come to my home and try to help me learn how to read again. And she would bring me all of these materials that most of the materials that are designed to teach people how to read are designed with 5-year-olds in mind, right? And it's really hard for me at the age of 24 to sit there and get invested in trying to read a story about Polly the parrot making friends at the zoo, right? So I was having a really hard time, and she was the one who was like, let's figure out something you like that can help you learn how to read again. So we sat down and looked at my Steam library of video games on my computer, and there were thousands of games. And we went through and tried to find ones that I could do with minimal reading, with no ability to type, and only one hand. And the list from my thousands of games that I have went down to like 3 or 4 games. But it was a start, and we were able to kind of get me started motivating myself to read. We'd turn down the sound and turn on the subtitles and see if I could still keep up with what was going on. And it just really opened my eyes to the fact that like video games have largely excluded disabled people for a very long time. And in the past 10 years or so, there have been just really great strides in video game accessibility. So I've been really, really pleased to be a part of that over the past decade.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for sharing that about your personal challenges, and you've obviously come in an amazing way forward from that. I was wondering, before that happened, were you on what kind of track were you on in terms of your pursuit of education and career?
I was just pursuing coding, video game coding. I was working at the corporation that I work for now, Eagles Flight. They do these corporate training games. I was working for them, and on the side was working for some little indie developer studios, making video games and making some games myself for fun. That was really the path that I was on. And it just entirely shifted to strictly accessibility focused after that. And I have come a long way in terms of like my ability to speak, for example. I no longer struggle with aphasia like I did, but because I have multiple sclerosis now, that's a degenerative disease that gets worse over time. So I don't know what parts of that are going to enter my life again in the future. And I'm really passionate about the removal of barriers, not just for other people, but also because I want to be able to still do things in the future. And the way that the world is currently built, there are a lot of things I might not be able to do in 5 years, 10 years. And I would like to remove those barriers as much as possible. Yeah. I think that people who have like no ability to read, I do have cognitive dysfunction still that makes it difficult for me to read. So I use a screen reader. I'm a sighted screen reader user, and I use voice to text because I have difficulty with, still reading and writing. And it's just amazing to me how many areas of the world are inaccessible, and areas of video games and tech that are inaccessible to people like me, that it just is so simple to just make them accessible.
Well, I mean, a lot of people that may not be involved in accessibility directly really don't understand the importance of the use of screen readers for many people like yourselves and people who may be blind or low vision, and then just keyboard only access, in that's a way to connect up other devices to be able to interact with the computer. And so I think there's been some progress in that area, but there's still a long way to go. In terms of your situation, after you had the stroke and were on the road to recovery, was there a time where you discovered accessibility as a profession separate from it being something that you were hoping to help with your recovery and your interest in gaming?
Yeah, it really started with me wanting to be able to play games and contacting development studios and being like, look, I have a career history in video game development. I see a barrier here to people like me. We can't play your game. And I also know the fix. And I would just like reach out to development studios and ask them to fix things. And I was also streaming on Twitch a lot at the time. And there was this built community of other people who wanted to play games and also had disabilities who came and would hang out in my Twitch streams. And so I would become aware of more issues, and I gained a platform in a few different video games. I became partnered with a few game development companies as a Twitch streamer. So I had a voice to speak for people who would come to my stream and be like, I'm low vision and I actually would really like to see this change. A lot of colorblind folks being like, I can't play this game. I can't even watch you play it because there's no colorblind mode. So I was able to start advocating for people, and that turned into, why don't I do this for my job? Does anyone do this for their job? Like, is there video game accessibility? And I started reaching out and connecting with other specialists in the industry who do focus just on accessibility, people like Ian Hamilton and Tara Volker and Bryce Johnson, and people who were early days already talking about, not early days, it should have been from square one that we're trying to make games accessible, but it's really just been in the past 10 years or so. And I found other game developers at conferences and things like A11Y or Ally TO is a conference here in Canada that happens every year that's specifically about digital accessibility. And they have a gaming only conference portion as well now, where a few days of the conference are all just about video game accessibility. And I've met so many people there. And then there's like GA Conf overseas. I would go to these conferences that are focused on video game accessibility and meet others in the industry who work in video game development, care about accessibility, but maybe didn't know how to implement it. And then also I would meet people who knew how to implement it and maybe didn't work in. So it became this hive mind collaborative thing. And I'm still really good friends with a lot of these colleagues because we met at a time when there wasn't a ton of discussion around accessibility in video games. And it's kind of grown from there to now, where there are studios like Ubisoft and Naughty Dog, and there are just a lot of studios, and Xbox, they have a huge focus now on accessibility, and they have teams that their entire job is to just make games more accessible. So yeah, I kind of evolved into the position of a digital accessibility specialist rather than just a video game developer and a coder and a programmer. While the industry evolved, we kind of evolved alongside each other, which has been interesting. And
Well,
I was by no means a trailblazer of that. I got to kind of like follow the trail that other people had already set out.
Well, one of the things that you've been doing, which is extremely valuable, is your advocacy, your evangelism, and using your position to provide a voice for others to these organizations, and that makes a difference. You mentioned Xbox, and Bryce Johnson is one of the people that we've interviewed for this, and Bryce was kind enough to invite to host our local Seattle Inclusive Design and Accessibility meetup group at the Accessibility Lab on their campus, and you see something like that, and it just shows a really thoughtful approach to bringing people in with various disabilities to think out of the box about what gaming could be, and also working through some of the hard problems.
Yeah, Bryce Johnson is a phenomenal guy, and honestly, I think all of the people that I've met through my video game accessibility work have been just really great people. And it's an interesting dynamic to go to these conferences over any other type of accessibility conference or any other type of development conference, because meeting up with these people, it's just such an empathy driven industry. Everyone really cares about making sure that everyone can access play and joy and entertainment. And that's such a good vibe to be around. And all of these people that I've met don't just care about their job. Their job is not just a job. And for me, it's the same. It's like, our jobs aren't just a way that we make our money and have a 9 to 5. We're also trying to make it a difference in people's lives, as corny as that seems and sounds. But as a disabled individual myself, I know that the people who go out there and make things more accessible to me as a wheelchair user, for example, I use a wheelchair, and people who go out and actually make those changes in the world do have a real impact on my daily life, you know? And I think, I mean, Bryce Johnson, as an example, a couple of years ago when my MS started to progress a little bit more rapidly and I lost function in my left hand, um, he reached out to me not as Bryce Johnson from Xbox, but just as Bryce Johnson who knows some people, who knows some solutions. We're not just looking at, you know, only Microsoft solutions. Here's another thing I heard of that might help you. Here's another thing, like, what can we do to figure out a way you can still play the games you love? Like, we're all just in this because we want to make sure that people can still access enjoyment. There's this question that I get asked a lot where people will say, why do you focus on video game accessibility rather than like legislative changes and, you know, making sure there's wheelchair access to buildings? Why something as frivolous as video games? Like, why is that the thing you're the most passionate about? And I think there's this kind of idea that video games are just a nice to have, not a need to have. It's like, you know, it's just a thing that people can do for fun. But if disabled people can't do it, too bad. That's not the end of the world. But in my experience, like, the ability to connect with friends, the ability to have a hobby and enjoy your life and have fun and blow off steam, like, that is a need to have. This to me is as important as legislation and access to voting and access to all these other things that I do also care about and do also advocate for. But this is just as important. Just because it's video games and just because it's recreation doesn't mean it's not something that everyone needs to be able to access.
Yeah, and that, yeah, I mean, that if people represent it that way, it seems like a really narrow view. I mean, the video game industry actually, I believe, dwarfs traditional cinema in terms of the amount of money that's there and its reach. But if you look at what, you know, with the cinema going to film houses, for a long time, there's been accessibility built in both in physical spaces, but also in technology that's available. And the movies themselves for a long time have been available with closed captions and audible descriptions. So there's no reason that we shouldn't expect the video game industry to also be participating in those ways.
Yeah, and there are some really brilliant people out there who are coding just the most impressive things into video games nowadays just for sheer enjoyment. So taking those minds and that level of talent and ability and focusing it in on things like, let's make sure people with disabilities can play this game too. There's just so much potential there. And
in terms of the work that you're doing with video games on a day-to-day basis, like what types of things are you involved in? Are you providing feedback and consultancy? Are there any particular tasks that you normally have on a kind of daily, weekly basis with your work?
Yeah, I have a few projects ongoing right now. Bear with me as I scan my mind for NDA information. Sorry. Sure. That's the one thing about game development is studios are very, 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 very intense with the NDAs.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I mean, you can just talk about it generally if you want, you know, the types of activities you're involved in.
Yeah. For the most part, the most consulting work I do, like the most contract-based work that isn't for Eagles Flight, which is my main job right now, which I can talk about what I do there as well. But most of the work that I'm doing for like AAA studios and things like that, it's hiring me to look at barriers and the removal of barriers in the mechanics of the game and the mechanics of the gameplay. So it might look like sending me a few copies of a game to play through, or developer access to a not yet released game to try it out and then raise any issues that I see. Also, there's been a big push on just general education for development studios and their staff. So sometimes I'll get asked to come speak to staff about, like, here are some of the common barriers I see as a disabled gamer. here are some other things that other people have let me know they see as disabled gamers. And then with looking at it through the lens of having worked in game development myself, I can offer some best practices. So that's often kind of the work I do. And then there's also things that are more social aspect. And so sometimes I'm brought in more to talk about narrative of a game, to talk about the script, whether or not there's like too much ableist language, or like any ableist language is too much, but whether or not the language choices, like what are we saying to and about disabled people. If we're going to talk about disability in this game, if we're going to have disabled characters, we should have representation. Let's make sure it's realistic representation. Let's make sure it's respectful representation. Let's make sure that we're saying good things to and about disabled players who want to play this game. And let's make sure this game is accessible to the community that we're representing with this character. So if there's a blind character in a game, that's great to have representation, but it would really kind of be important not to profit off the experience of blind people and then not let them play your game because it's not accessible to blind people. So things like that I often consult on as well. It's kind of been all over the place. Game development studios will just reach out and say, look, we heard you did work with X studio. We heard you speak at this conference. We were wondering, we have this game idea. We want to put a disabled character in there. What should that look like? Can we run it by you what we're thinking? Or we want to do an initiative for accessibility in gaming. We want to do a marketing campaign to show that like everyone should access games, and we want to make sure that we're not being disrespectful. So can we run some of this by you? So a lot of things like that. It's kind of all over the place what I do. But the main chunk is probably the actual mechanics of a game, the actual code of a game, looking over that and saying like, this functionally doesn't work. People can't access this.
Well, you referred to it as all over the place, but to me, it sounds like you've crafted very thoughtful and comprehensive approach to a lot of different important aspects. As one of the things that another thing I always like to ask about is, people's thoughts about the future. We can always kind of look around us and see things that we think could be better. We're hopeful that could be better. There are also things that we may be looking forward to in the future personally to be working on for our own satisfaction and to help others. Are there any of those areas looking forward that you're particularly interested in or concerned about in terms of getting done?
Yeah, there are definitely some big gaps that I see in the current situation of accessibility in gaming in general. And specifically, I think there's so much cool potential in augmented reality and virtual reality gaming. So like VR headsets, that immersive gaming experience, and largely that's inaccessible to people with disabilities. I was on a panel recently with some others who also all are disabled individuals with a range of disabilities. And we were talking about gaming, and all of us were like, VR gaming just feels like it's something that we don't get to do. It's like, that's not for disabled people. And I don't want to live in a world where there's anything that it's like, that's not for disabled people. Everything should be for us too. So I would really love to see a push in, so games like Pokemon Go, with the augmented reality where you're walking around and using GPS to interact with this game. Not everyone can do that. There are people who aren't able to do all of those things. And during the pandemic, they changed their game entirely to make it more possible to play from home, where you still could go out and go for walks and meet up with people, but you also could experience most of the game just sitting in your home. And a lot of us with disabilities started playing during the pandemic. And then now, as they're scaling those accommodations back, they're saying, oh, the pandemic is over, which it's not, but they are saying it is. And they're saying, so let's scale this back and get back to normal. Well, normal, it's only normal based on a non-disabled person's standards. So it would be really great to see. And then in terms of VR gaming with the headsets and things, there are so many of us, like when I'm in my wheelchair, if I am playing a game with my Oculus Quest, for example, I have one, and there are so few games I can play where I'm sitting in one spot. You have to kind of move around, which is great. It's great to have that option. And I'm not saying we should do away with that in games, because for people who can do it, I'm sure that's incredibly fun. But for me, if it's a day that I'm using my wheelchair, I need to use my hands to move. So I can't shoot and walk at the same time. I can't paint a picture and move around at the same time. I need to use my hands. So I end up like shooting at the ground in a circle as I'm trying to move and run away from enemies. It would be great to have options that make those types of games also playable by disabled people. So I'm hoping that some people with more knowledge of VR gaming get into that space in terms of accessibility, because unfortunately I have no idea how to code a VR game. I have no idea how to actually work in that space, but I'd love to see change there for sure. I'd also love to see a lot more change that's like intersectional. I'd love to see a focus not just on like making games more accessible to just people with disabilities, but also to remember that people with disabilities come in all shapes and sizes and colors, and like there's and all racial backgrounds. So, you know, my experience as a white disabled person is different than the experience of a disabled Black person or person of color or Indigenous person. And that gets lost in the conversation sometimes. And a lot of panels that I've been on that have had some racial diversity, it's really highlighted how the experiences of white disabled players and Black disabled players, or cis disabled players and trans disabled players, are just really different. So I personally would like to see more of a focus on remembering that we're not a monolith. And if we're going to just try to, I've had corporations have me sit down and try to narrow down, who are we trying to make this game accessible for? Let's build a character. Let's build an avatar of a person that is the person we're trying to, like, are they like, what are they like? Are they a blind person? Are they and it's like, let's not narrow the focus so much when we're making things accessible. Let's make them accessible to as wide a range of people with a ton of different experiences. And that means centering the voices of people who have those experiences and making sure we're consulting with them and involving them in the process.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you. You've given me a lot to think about. I've learned a lot myself, things I hadn't considered before, and it's really great to see you know, all the work that you're doing in advocacy for this area. And you mentioned conferences, and in the olden days before the pandemic, I used to love to go to conferences, and maybe we'll meet up at an accessibility conference at some point.
That'd be great. I do miss the networking part of conferences, but since the pandemic, it's been easier to attend conferences as a disabled person, because for me anyway, for my set of disabilities, it's been a lot easier because I can watch things later at my own pace, or I can, you know, just stay in my home. So yeah, it's been interesting, but it will be good to get back to that social networking aspect.
All right. Thank you very much, Lorelei.
Thanks for having me.